approximately 1:35. And by 1:37, the defendant is captured on the watch guard camera running toward Corporal Cole's truck. It took under 2 minutes for Corporal Cole to approach John Williams to arrest him and for John Williams to respond by shooting Corporal Cole in the neck and leaving him for dead, thus starting an enormous manhunt involving all agencies of government and an extensive investigation into the death of Corporal Cole, which culminated in the arrest of John Williams and which brings us to court here today. On behalf of Assistant Attorney General Zania, Detective Andrews, and myself, we want to thank you for your close attention that you have paid to this case over the past week. The good news, you are within a few hours of getting this case to deliberate and render your verdict. Over the past week, the state has demonstrated to you beyond all doubt that John Williams is guilty of murder. When you go into the jury room, in order to find the defendant guilty, you must find that we have proven 3 things, just 3 things, that the defendant intentionally or knowingly caused the death of Corporal Eugene Cole. There is not going to be any question, of course, that Corporal Cole is dead. Nor is there any question for you that this man caused the death of Corporal Cole. What you're going to be asked to consider primarily, the only thing in dispute here between the state and the defense, is whether or not the defendant acted intentionally or knowingly when he shot Corporal Cole in the neck, killing him instantly. There is one other point which you will be asked to consider. It's nothing you have to spend a lot of time on, but one thing you will be asked is whether or not you found that the gun used had a serial number of 317-65479. And I would suggest that you just take a look at this photograph and you'll see that it matches. Now, Justice Mullen is the expert on the law, and he will instruct you on the law as it relates to the terms intentionally or knowingly. And he will tell you that intention means conscious object to cause death. Knowing means you're practically certain that your conduct will cause death. Justice Mullen will also tell you that in order to find the defendant guilty of murder, you must all agree that the defendant acted intentionally or knowingly when he shot Corporal Cole. And your verdict must be unanimous. You do not need to be unanimous as to the theory of the crime. And I want to explain that for a second because it's an important point here. Some of you may believe when the defendant put the muzzle of the gun up to Corporal Cole's neck, he certainly intended to cause his death. You all may believe that. But others of you might believe that when the defendant put the muzzle of the gun up against Corporal Cole's death, he was aware that it was practically certain that death would result, but it wasn't necessarily his conscious object. So some of you may believe he acted intentionally, some of you may believe he acted knowingly, and so long as you all believe one of those two, you must find the defendant guilty. Justice Mullen's also going to tell you that the state does not need to prove premeditation. And that point is particularly relevant in this case. Premeditation is the planning ahead of the murder. It is not, and it does not require to be proven. Intent can be formed in an instant, in the instant before the death-producing conduct. Again, this is an important point. The intent to cause death can be formed in the instant before the death-producing conduct. So when John Williams put the muzzle of the 9mm up against Corporal Cole's neck, I submit to you the moment he pulled the trigger, John Williams either intended or was practically certain that death would result. The intent to cause death can be formed in the moment before it happens. John Williams, who knows and respects guns, according to his friend Chris Williams. John Williams, who carries guns because he can. He's a self-proclaimed gun guy. And that's relevant here. That's not a comment on guns. It's important here because he knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't shoot Corporal Cole in the leg or the arm or some other benign location. He didn't stand across the yard and wave the gun. He went and approached Corporal Cole and put that gun up against his neck. He shot him in the neck, and that bullet traveled right to left and cut his spinal cord before exiting his body. This man knew exactly what he was doing. So why, if he is so out of it, so high on drugs, did he have the wherewithal to commit and know where to kill him? I submit to you, it's because he knew exactly what he was doing. As Dr. Flomenbaum told you, Corporal Cole died quickly. So you might ask yourselves, and the state doesn't have to prove motive, why did this man kill Corporal Cole? And he did so because he didn't want to go back to jail. It's about that simple. The defendant told the detectives, and during my closing, I'm going to read a lot from the transcript because I think it's important that you hear it from the transcript and not hear me synopsize it. He said, and this is on page 24, I didn't want to get arrested. I didn't want to. I didn't know for what, and I didn't know. Last thing I knew, I was just going to get thrown in handcuffs again for no reason. So I just instinctively just grabbed my pistol, pointed at him. I made that choice. Does that sound like the actions of a man who's so intoxicated that he didn't know his actions would cause death? He made the choice to use the firearm on Corporal Cole because he wanted to cause his death. You will receive an instruction from Justice Mullen about voluntary intoxication. And you're entitled to consider, and the defense will ask you to consider that the defendant was so high, so strung out, that he couldn't form the intent or act knowingly when he shot Corporal Cole. And I would submit to you that does not make any sense in light of the defendant's very own statements to you. The defendant understood what he was doing, and he understood the consequences of his actions, which is exactly why he took off into the woods. The defendant told Detective Andrews and April O'Grady there were other choices he could have made, such as running away, submitting to the arrest, kicking the door, you'll remember he said, so that he can get inside and then the police would have to get a warrant. The defendant knew there were other choices, but he chose the one that resulted in Corporal's death because that ensured, of course, he wouldn't be arrested and he wouldn't return to jail. The choice to execute Corporal Cole was the only choice that would ensure he could follow through with his plan. Excuse me. Not to go back to jail in Massachusetts, where he was facing a significant period of time. It was the only choice in his mind to get Christina out of jail by confessing that the drugs in her vehicle belonged to him. And then his choice to kill himself to save his friends and family from what was apparently a threat or the wrath of his drug supplier, Orlando. On Friday, ladies and gentlemen, you might remember, you heard the testimony about whether or not the goals of this defendant were rational or not. And I'm going to submit to you that this is an important point, because the point here is not whether or not this defendant was acting rationally, but whether or not he was acting intentionally or knowingly. While Dr. Steinberg and Dr. O'Grady had differing opinions about whether or not the defendant acted rationally, they both agreed he acted in a goal-directed manner, which meant and I would submit to you, he acted intentionally. You might recall on Friday I asked Dr. O'Grady if she had formed an opinion whether the defendant acted in a goal-directed manner in the early morning hours and around April 25th. And she said yes, because he was able to have goals and achieve them. He arranged to be picked up on the Indian Ridge Apartments and brought to Kim Searway's house. He was able to raise bail money for his girlfriend. He was able to sell drugs to different people to maintain his personal habit. The defendant is actually at this time, and the time leading up, he's engaged in a complex business plan. He has drugs fronted to him. He sells those drugs to people in the community every day, returns the money to his supplier, and does it all over again the next day. John Williams' tolerance for drugs is high. His norm is to be high. He lived his life, ran his drug business, supplied himself with drugs, all while functioning high. He was akin to a functioning alcoholic. His friend Chris Williams told you that Chris Williams, did a lot of drugs, but he could drive, he could make plans, he lived that way too. Being high is normal to them. So this defendant's normal is high. And when you're high, and the defendant, you can form intent, because you do it every day of your life, day in and day out. Even Dr. Steinberg, the man on the videotape deposition, said, I agree. It's an intentional act. He didn't accidentally pull the trigger. Even the defense's own expert told you it was an intentional act. It is worth noting that Dr. Steinberg was focused on the defendant not acting rationally. But you remember, he didn't look at Maine law. He didn't understand, apparently, that whether or not the fact that the defendant was rational or not rational is really irrelevant, because the issue is whether or not the defendant acted intentionally or knowingly. When you think about it, murder's rarely a rational act. Maybe sometimes in self-defense, but murder simply isn't rational. But that's not your question. I want to take a moment and sort of step back, if I might, and talk to you a little bit about the arrest of John Williams. It's important for you, perhaps, to appreciate that the reason the defense focused on the arrest of John Williams is that the defense wants you to ignore the defendant's confession. I anticipate that the defense will argue that the confession is unreliable, that you should ignore it. I'm also anticipating that Attorney Parody may say that Mr. Williams basically told law enforcement whatever they wanted out of fear or for the benefit of food. I anticipate you may hear that. And I will argue to you now, I will argue to you later, that the defense is doing this because they recognize that the defendant, during that interview with Detective Andrews, confessed to intentional or knowing murder. What they want to do is distance themselves as far as possible from that confession. Ladies and gentlemen, you do not have to like what happened during the arrest. Some might say it is a black mark on an otherwise outstanding investigation. But there are two things I would ask you to consider about the arrest. First, the arrest team knew they were looking for an armed man who had just killed a police officer. Williams had successfully hidden from the police for 3+ days in a heavily wooded area. The defendant's friend, you remember this, Chris Williams, told police the defendant was heavily armed and suicidal. You'll also remember that the search teams were finding ammunition on the trail. They knew he was armed. The defendant had enough firepower to take all 7 members of that arrest team out if he had seen them first. The arrest teams knew this was an extremely high-risk situation, as described by Warden McCabe. Once arrested, it happened fast. One can only imagine the need to get Williams into handcuffs because they are sitting ducks if anybody else is in that cabin, and they have no way of knowing if anybody else is in that cabin. I am not standing here asking you to condone the physical force that was used on John Williams or asking you to condone the photograph that was taken, but I am suggesting to you that tensions were high, and it is very difficult to predict how anyone would react under similar circumstances. Yet everyone in the woods that day came out alive. The arrest has absolutely nothing to do with the shooting of Corporal Cole 3.5 days earlier. Again, the defense will argue that you should consider the arrest in the context of the defendant's confession. But it's important to remember that by the time the defendant got to Waterville Police Department and met with Detective Andrews, where he had some food, warmth, and some clothing, you look at those statements, he does not appear fearful, he is in a conversational tone. And these statements are reliable and mostly truthful. And the reason I say mostly is you might recall that the defendant during the interview suggested a few times that he didn't know why he was being arrested by Corporal Cole. And I would submit to you that's a bit disingenuous. When he claims to be about ready to confess to possessing cocaine to get Christina out of jail, and this is the man who is dealing drugs and possessing drugs day in and day out for an extended period of time. So to suggest that he doesn't know why he's being arrested isn't exactly forthcoming. And there's some minimization going on. The other important thing about the arrest that I would ask you to consider is that Detective Andrews was not present at the arrest scene and did not know any of the facts of the arrest prior to the interview of the defendant. You might remember the defendant attempted to minimize the facts, such as Corporal Cole was reaching for a gun, and Detective Andrews did call his bluff, and the defendant yet again during that interview admitted to gunning down Corporal Cole. There is just nothing to suggest that this defendant confessed to Detective Andrews out of fear. In his opening, Attorney Parody said to you that John Williams told the detectives whatever they wanted to hear so he could have food and sleep. Mr. Parody in his opening statement said the defendant thought they, meaning Andrews and Quintero, would protect him from future harm. There is simply no evidence, none, before you, that Detective Andrews gave the defendant food in exchange for information. And it's worth noting that one of the very first things that Detective Andrews said to the defendant when they got in the car said, "We're going to go someplace to talk. Is that okay?" To which the defendant said, "Yeah." And because Detective Andrews was not present at the arrest and he didn't know what happened at the cabin, he asked him if he was injured. And the defendant responds, "No, I'm just hungry. I haven't eaten in 4 days." And then shortly thereafter, Detective Andrews says again, "John, do you want to talk to us?" And the defendant said yes. The defense desperately wants you to ignore the confession and suggest there's some sort of quid pro quo here, food for information, and it's just not borne out by the evidence. In the confession, you will remember the defendant has a great memory of what occurred that night. And from the confession, it is very clear that the defendant had resentment against Corporal Cole because Corporal Cole arrested his girlfriend. John Williams told the detective he didn't trust him and he didn't trust why he was under arrest. And then he goes on and describes in detail what happened in the early morning hours. So we can imagine that that John Williams sees Corporal Cole at the Cumberland Farms gas pumps as Chris Zielinski is driving him to Kim Sirwa's house. Remember, he ducks down in the car. The defendant must have believed the police were looking for him. When Chris Zielinski and John see Corporal Cole driving slowly by Kim's house, the defendant is certainly aware that it's a deputy's truck going by his house and says so to Chris Zielinski and says, "Geez, Chris, you might want to sit tight." And Chris says, "I'm legal. I'm leaving." So the defendant's already angry and full of resentment at Corporal Cole for the arrest of his girlfriend. And so when the defendant is approached by Corporal Cole and asked if he is if he's John Williams, you'll remember that he walks up and asks, "Are you John Williams?" And he starts to reach for his wrist to place him under arrest. And at that point, Detective Andrews said, asked him, "So were you angry?" "I had resentment, I just didn't trust him. I didn't trust him. I didn't trust why I was being under arrest. I don't even know for what. I mean, do you know what the charges were he was trying to give me?" And then Detective Andrews says, "So what happened when you didn't want to get arrested?" "I pulled my pistol and I got the jump on him and shot him." "Where did you shoot him?" "I shot him in the head." "Where was he?" "He was on the ground." When Detective Andrews is clarifying this, he goes on to say, he goes, how did he get on the ground?" "He slipped. He slipped while he was trying to retreat. He slips due to the terrain and stumbles and falls." And then Detective Andrews says, "And then what?" To which this defendant said, I decided to eliminate him." "You decide to eliminate him? Is that what you said?" "Yeah, that's what I said." What is Corporal Cole saying? "I don't know. He says no." If there is any doubt in your mind that the defendant was acting intentionally, that statement alone speaks volumes. I decided to eliminate him. He made a decision at that moment in time that he was going to kill Corporal Cole, and he did. He accomplished exactly what he set out to do. To suggest otherwise is simply inconsistent with all of the evidence. Not only did the defendant execute him, Corporal Cole would have known he was going to die. After telling Detective Andrews that he decided to eliminate him, as I just said to you, Detective Andrews said, what did he say? He said no. Dr. O'Grady told you on Friday that the defendant told her when he pulled the gun, the deputy began to run, but he slipped to the ground. He said no. Corporal Cole said no because he knew he was going to die. I believe Mr. Parody said in his opening that the defendant intended to pull the trigger, but not cause his death. Do you remember Mr. Parody saying that? He intended to pull the trigger, but not cause death. And with all due respect to Mr. Parody, he's a very good lawyer. We've done many cases together. But I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that statement does not make any sense. John Williams knows guns. He respects guns. He does not treat them like toys. John Williams knows exactly what happens when you put the muzzle of a 9mm to a man's neck and pull the trigger. The target is eliminated. He did what he intended to do. Corporal Cole would be eliminated and was eliminated, and then John Williams would not be arrested. The defendant made that clear to Detective Andrews on multiple occasions and confirmed it several weeks later to April O'Grady. Corporal Cole had no chance against John Williams. Corporal Cole was never able to unlock his gun from his holster, and the retention strap remained in place. You will have this photograph, which is State's Exhibit number 25. It's coming up on the screen. The target is eliminated, and look at Corporal Cole's gun. He can never flip the safety strap. He has absolutely no chance once he slipped and fell against this armed defendant. He simply didn't have any time to react. But when the detectives talked to John Williams about how he pulled out his gun, he tells him exactly what happened. So they talk about where the gun is. So you had it tucked in your pants. So at what point do you take the safety off that gun? Was when I was pulling it out, when he was retreating backwards and he fell, by the time I had it pointed at him, he was already on the ground. That's where I had already flicked it up to fire mode, and then I squeezed the trigger. Was the clip full? Yes, 14. Corporal Cole is falling to the ground, and as he's losing his balance, this man pulls his gun out of the front of his pants, flips off the safety, and all he has to do is fire. But before he did, he had to go in nice and close so he could put that muzzle right up to his neck. And that was the decision that he made. And during the course of this interview, this defendant leaves out just how close he is. How close, but it's Corporal Cole's body that told us just how close he got. Dr. Mark Flomenbaum told you it was a contact range shot. So if the defendant is trying to placate or tell the officers what they want to hear, as suggested by the defense, he did a heck of a good job mirroring the physical evidence. Investigator Larry Morrill looked at the reports of Dr. Flomenbaum, Detective Paul White, firearms expert Kim James, and Sergeant Scott Bryant, and put together a shooting reconstruction based on science. This examination and subsequent reenactment by Investigator Morrill and Sergeant Bryant brought to life the findings of the medical and scientists at the lab and the ERTs on the scene. Obviously, Corporal Cole was not in a standing position at the time of the shooting. And you understood why not. I mean, if you had been shot here, the bullet comes out here, it would have ended up in the school. That's just the way it was. And Dr. Flomenbaum told you that the way the trajectory of the bullet was, there's no way that this man was standing, that Corporal Cole was standing. And that's confirmed by the defendant himself. Based on the examination of the dirt on his uniform, the bird's nest near the toe of his boot, Corporal Cole did fall to the ground. The boots, the bird's nest on the ground, explain that Corporal Cole was likely trying to get up after having fallen down. And the defendant, as I suggested earlier, came right in and put that gun tight to his neck. And we know that because the gunpowder and gases end up mostly in the wound. And just a little bit of that escapes on the collar. And that's because while it's a contact wound, the gun would have been slightly tilted, allowing some of the gases to escape. These scientific findings corroborate most of the defendant's statements. What the defendant doesn't say, and now is very clear, is that when the defendant murders Corporal Cole, he is on his right-hand side of him, very close to him, when he pulls the trigger. And it is Eugene Cole's body and the area around him that confirms the defendant's statements. Following the shooting, the defendant knew he had to get away. More evidence that he knew exactly what he was doing. His decision to take a heavy submachine gun, ammunition, and a 9mm into the woods is an interesting choice. He certainly didn't need a submachine gun to commit suicide. He, however, was very well prepared if a confrontation came while law enforcement was looking for him. The defendant not only knew what he was doing before the murder, but afterwards as well. He took a lot of firepower, he loaded it into Eugene Cole's truck and took off. He knew he had to get off the Mercer Road. He robbed Cumberland Farms for cigarettes. And you remember that video of Cumberland Farms? He walked into that store with a purpose. He went and he got his water, and he went up to the cashier. He wasn't confused in there. He knew exactly what he was doing. He got his needs met. He even asked for a lighter. He then drove to his friend Ricky Austin's house, a friend of his. He was able to make it from Cumberland Farms to Ricky Austin's house, where he parked the cruiser around back. It's dark. And he also said in that interview, as I was driving, I could hear over the radio that they were trying to ping Eugene Cole's phone. And that led to his decision to later get rid of all of the phones in his hands, or in his possession. He understood that they could ping people's phones and locate you. So he puts the truck in an area that wouldn't be found until perhaps after daylight. And he asks Chris Williams to come pick him up. And when Chris Williams comes to pick him up, he gives him a pipe, and he ends up giving him his phone, and he later threw that away. And off he goes into the woods. Ladies and gentlemen, people are arrested every single day. People are arrested every day on drug charges. No one wants to get arrested. Yes, this defendant's life was in absolute chaos. Chaos he brought upon himself by making bad choice after bad choice after bad choice. He made the choice to deal drugs. He made the choice to leave the traffic stop in which his girlfriend was arrested. Remember that? He just left her there. He made the choice to steal Corporal Cole's vehicle after killing him, and he made the choice to rob Cumberland Farms for water and cigarettes. He made the choice to ditch the truck. He made the choice to speak. He made the choice to speak with Detective Andrews. Bad choices have consequences, and the defendant's choice to eliminate Corporal Cole, who was just doing his job. The consequence for that is I submit to you a verdict of guilty of the crime of murder. At the conclusion of my closing, Mr. Parody will have the opportunity to give his closing, and I will have one more opportunity to address you. It will be brief. And at that time, I will again ask you to find John Williams guilty of the crime of murder. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Parody.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a long and tiring past week. It's required a lot of thought, it's required a lot of efforts, and it's required a lot of work. And while you haven't necessarily yet begun the hard part of your work, I'm sure you certainly were tired at the end of last week, and we all appreciate that. I told you in opening, you were carefully questioned and selected because of your ability and expressed ability to be fair and impartial and not apply sympathy, which in this tragic case would be very easy to do. I also told you, and hopefully nothing I've said or done during the trial contradicts the fact that nobody is claiming that Deputy Cole was a bad man. Nobody was claiming that Deputy Cole should have died that night. In fact, Mr. Williams himself told Dr. O'Grady he started crying when describing the details and expressed his sincere remorse. Now, I want to talk a little bit. The judge is going to tell you what beyond a reasonable doubt means. I gave you my version of what I submit to you it means in opening, and I'm going to just reiterate that reasonable doubt is the highest standard in our justice system for a very good reason, and it has been that way since our founding fathers. We became a country, and it is that the state must prove to you that Mr. Williams intentionally and knowingly caused the death of Corporal Cole, and that it's almost certainly true. That is almost certainly true. And I think I told you in opening, it's not whether the state has proven to you that it's probable that Mr. Williams intentionally and knowingly caused the death of Corporal Cole. It's not that it's likely, it's not that it's possible, and it's not that maybe, and any other things that you can think of. It's most certainly true. And the state, Ms. Marchese, and probably appropriately so, has highlighted and focused my opening statement where I said Mr. Williams intentionally pulled the trigger. Maybe a poor choice of words, because I'm going to submit to you that the state's burden in this case is not to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Williams intentionally and knowingly pulled the trigger, or that he made a decision to pull the trigger. That's not what you're asked to do. He's charged with knowing and intentionally causing the death of Corporal Cole. So your job, I submit to you, is to determine that when he made that decision, whether or not he made the decision intentionally to pull the trigger is not the question. The question is whether or not when he did that, he intentionally and knowingly meant to cause the death of Corporal Cole. Now, you heard a lot about how Mr. Williams was functioning before and after the shooting, and the choices he was making and the things he was doing. Nobody has claimed, Dr. Steinberg has told you, Chris Williams has told you, nobody has claimed that people who are as high as Mr. Williams was can't function. Alcoholics who are impaired can function. It's not whether he could function, it's whether his drug use and his intoxication at that very moment, not in hindsight, not when he's sitting at a police department being fed and being asked questions, not now, whether looking back at it, it's at the very instant he pulled that trigger. And you saw the video how quickly that was. That interaction was less than 2 minutes. I believe your recollection, but I thought it was around at most minute 45 seconds. That was happening fast. And you need to determine that it was at that moment when that happened. Now, presumably, that's going to be very difficult for you to do, because how can you put yourself in Mr. Williams' head? You can't. Presumably, none of you are functioning on no sleep for the past week. Presumably, you're well rested. Presumably, you're not under the influence of crack cocaine and heroin. And so you are going to have a difficult task. So what do you have to do in order to get in his head the moment he pulled that trigger? You have the evidence. You have, I suggest to you, some of the most compelling testimony that you heard was from the man, Chris Williams, who said he was Mr. Williams' friend, but he said he used to consider him a friend or something along those lines. And what did he tell you? The first thing Mr. Williams told him was he said he's shocked. He was surprised. He didn't mean to kill Corporal Cole. He didn't mean to. He told Dr. O'Grady, it was like I was watching myself in a third person. It was happening so fast and so quickly. And then, after I heard the shot, I snapped back to reality like a rubber band. You also have Dr. Steinberg's testimony about how a person under the influence of the amount of drugs that Mr. Williams was using would have been thinking in that moment. And he told you, sure, could Mr. Williams have made the decision to pull the trigger? And when he said it was an intentional act, if you remember his testimony, he didn't say killing him was an intentional act. He said he was asked whether pulling the trigger was an intentional act. Again, I submit to you that that's not your issue. You may consider it. You may consider that when you're considering whether when he did that he intentionally and knowingly meant to cause the death. But that's not Dr. Steinberg's testimony that I suggest. The state has suggested that, but I suggest to you otherwise. So you have to, what else do you have? You have Mr. Williams' statements that he just instinctively pulled the trigger. You're right, and I mean the state's right. He had experience with firearms. He knew how they worked. His friend told you he was extremely careful with them. He didn't play with them. He didn't fool around with them. But in the moment he was approached by Corporal Cole, early morning hours, and I know you heard how much drug use he had. In fact, he was smoking crack in the few moments Corporal Cole was circling around his house. Here's an individual sitting there while an officer's about to approach him, or possibly about to approach him, smoking crack. So you have evidence that he was extremely high. And he said it happened so fast, he just instinctively took out his gun and shot Corporal Cole, not to cause his death. He has never said that. He might have said decide to eliminate. We'll get to that in a minute. He said his intention at that time was to get out of being arrested, which I think you heard testimony. I believe you heard testimony but from Dr. Steinberg that doesn't make any sense, because now you've just going to get yourself arrested for something worse. And then, sure, was he acting instinctively when he started, when he was trying to secure more drugs to get in Corporal Cole's vehicle? Was he thinking that through to get in the Corporal Cole's vehicle, that they're going to be looking for him? He made instinctual choices. That doesn't mean that it was instinct. So just as the shooting was, Mr. Williams was acting on adrenaline and instinct. And I think Chris Williams told you that people on crack, he describes as being hypervigilant, as being paranoid, and that's exactly the state I suggest to you Mr. John Williams was in on that evening. Now, I'm going to offer you, when you're considering this, when you're considering intentional and knowing, I want to give you a couple of scenarios that I thought of. Not only was Mr. Williams impaired, as you heard, he was extremely fatigued. You heard Dr. Steinberg say, nobody wants people who are fatigued working on their cars, or that residents have limits because the more tired they get, the harder it is to think. A heart surgeon may be impaired and fatigued and intentionally open up a person to perform heart surgery and intentionally manipulate his or her tools to conduct that surgery. But if that person harms the individual they're performing surgery on them, would we say he did that knowingly and intentionally? A person can intentionally, because they want to get home, get in their motor vehicle and unfortunately strike a person and kill them. Would we question whether they intended and knowingly wanted to kill a person by intentionally getting in their vehicle? There's no dispute about Mr. Williams' drug use. And I want to talk a little bit about this reenactment, which I'm going to go back to what I started by saying, beyond a reasonable doubt is not based on possibilities, assumptions, likelihoods, surmises, probabilities. It's based on information that is most certainly true. And I submit, you heard the testimony from Officer Morrow, but I submit to you that that testimony was based on probabilities, possibilities, assumptions. And he told you the way he reenacted that was a possibility. But what's even more telling about his testimony? His testimony is that there would have been significant projectile blood from Corporal Cole. There was back spatter, and there was the gush blood, and then he told you that Mr. Williams was likely the intermediate that stopped that blood from getting on Corporal Cole's upper sleeve. Now, two things are very important about this. One, if Mr. Williams' hand and gun were in close proximity to Corporal Cole's neck when it ejected blood, wouldn't it make sense that there would be blood, or at least some DNA evidence on the end of that muzzle? Now, the state will probably come up and rebut me and say, well, he was out in the elements, and you heard that the elements can do that. His DNA was found on the handle. The rain didn't wash that away, and it would have been a significant amount. So if there's nothing there, then how can we say, beyond a reasonable doubt, it was in close proximity? More importantly, if Mr. Williams' hand would have been in close proximity when that gush of blood came out, wouldn't it make sense it would have been all over his hands? And it would have still been wet. It took him 2 seconds to get into the vehicle. It would have been all over the steering wheel. They didn't find it. They didn't find his blood. They found his DNA, his own DNA. They didn't find Corporal Cole's blood. And you saw the video. He was rifling all through his bag. He was all over the place. And there was never a piece of blood of Corporal Cole's found on anything that belonged to that man. That's important, because that questions the validity of where Mr. Williams was located. And that's another point. You saw the PowerPoint of Officer Morrow where he had the bullet coming in this way. And he denied that a person could have been more forward when that bullet went through. I suggest to you it didn't make sense, his answer, but that's up to you to believe. So, I think with regard to, let me strike that. With regard to the reenactment, you give it the appropriate weight. But I submit there's evidence for you to strongly question that. Now, I am not telling you to ignore the confession as Ms. Marchese suggested that is what I'm doing. That's not what I'm saying. Mr. Williams has never denied he shot Corporal Cole. What I'm asking you to do is consider the reliability of that. And the arrest is important because he was harmed and he was taunted. And then he viewed these very nice detectives as people who were not going to hurt him. They didn't threaten him. I never disputed they did. They didn't threaten him. They got him food. They got him drink. And he knew he was going to be able to sleep. And you can infer from the evidence that he knew he would be safe. And if nothing else, what is very interesting about the state's arguments to you about Mr. Williams' statements to police is that I believe she told you some are reliable, some aren't reliable. He's lying in some places, he's minimizing or lying over here, but the places we want you to believe he's not lying, he's telling the truth. You listen to the interrogation. Mr. Williams began by describing a much less of an event than deciding to eliminate Corporal Cole. So you can decide whether Mr. Williams believed that implicitly, through no one has claimed that these detectives promised him anything. They did promise him food. We agree they didn't promise him food in order for him to talk. But you can infer that this man implicitly believed he wouldn't be beaten, he would get food, he would get sleep, and he was going to please these officers. You saw the video, the shape that this man was in. 3 or 4 days in the woods, emaciated, hadn't had drugs for a couple of days. Sores all over him. A huge bump on his eye that you have pictures of, caused by officers. This was a man who was just trying to get his needs met. And you are the ones who get to decide the reliability of what he told the officers. So, a few things in conclusion. You folks were very careful and attentive. I don't need to go through all the evidence that you heard. You heard me not question multiple witnesses, all of the state's evidence that came in. There was no dispute about those things. That was what I told you from the beginning, was not a question of whether Mr. Williams shot Deputy Cole and whether Deputy Cole, whether that shooting led to Deputy Cole's death. There's no dispute about that. But please, don't take that for me not thinking that any part of this case is not important. It's all important. You need to have all the evidence. It's just, that's not our defense. Our defense is that the moment he pulled that trigger, that he did not intentionally, knowingly mean to cause the death of Deputy Cole. And then I would just like to finalize by saying, Ms. Marchese just told you this, and she gets to come up and go last because it's her burden of proof. We don't have to prove anything to you, but it's their burden of proof. And unfortunately, what always happens is I'm going to go sit down there, and Ms. Marchese is going to say something to you that I'm going to be like, oh man, I forgot to address that. But I suggest to you that when that happens, you think about what my response would be, since I can't give you one. And I suggest to you that when you go in the jury room and you carefully and without bias and sympathy put your collective minds together and consider whether Mr. Williams acted intentionally and knowingly, I suggest to you, you will conclude that he didn't. And I would ask you to return a not guilty verdict on the crime of murder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cardy. Ms. Marchese.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defendant may regret speaking with Detective Andrews. He may even regret shooting Corporal Cole. And while it is unfortunate that he may regret his actions, it does not in any way, shape, or form negate his intent to kill Corporal Cole. I'm going to ask you to put yourself in this defendant's head. You pull a gun out from your waistband. You click the safety off. You get the jump on Corporal Cole while he is on the ground. You go to the right of Corporal Cole. You put that muzzle up against his neck. You can't be very far from him. The only conclusion that you can reach here is that he had to intend to cause his death. This is not a situation where he's standing far away, as I said to you before, and shoots in his direction. That is not what this case is. This is a man who approached Corporal Cole, who was on the ground. Now, Mr. Parody says he takes issue with the reenactment. And if you don't like the reenactment, you can ignore it. But what we cannot do is ignore the science around the reenactment, because that reenactment was based on the science and the contact wound on his neck. You can't ignore Dr. Flomenbaum and Kim James. They're the ones that confirm that the reenactment is correct. It's worth mentioning page 40 of the interview, where Detective Andrews, or excuse me, Scott Quintero said, where did you shoot him? In the head. Where in his head? In the center of it, on the side. So when you say the side, if you use my face as a reference, like this side, you shot him on the side of the head, so he wasn't looking at you. He fell backwards. He was reaching. Hand was up. And what kind of, you said he made some kind of plea to you there? Yeah, I think he said no. There's just no question at all, that this man intended Corporal Cole's death. Mr. Parody says this is a tragic case. The defendant said in his interview, there is no happy ending. The defendant said to you there is no happy ending because even he knows that he is guilty. And I ask you for the last time to find him guilty of the murder of Corporal Eugene Cole. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney McKay. Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen, juries, would you please indulge me and stand for a moment? You've heard from both sides. The attorneys have presented to you their evidence and have explained in their closing arguments how they believe you should view the evidence and what conclusions you should draw from the evidence, depending upon the interests that they represent.